Honestly, what even is this book? Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written and illustrated by Frank Miller, the first issue of The Dark Knight Strikes Again was published by DC Comics in December of 2001, with the third and final issue being released in July of 2002. And Batman needs an army. With Lex Luthor rising to power and the heroes that we once knew falling in line with his rule, Bruce will emerge from the underground with his Bat Boys to restore order by any means necessary. But is the Dark Knight that we once knew so far gone that he can't return? And did I really have to Google a description to get a clear understanding on what the plot of this book even is? Okay, in the past I've received complaints that I'm often too negative towards the book, and I don't want this to be a complete beatdown on The Dark Knight Strikes Again, but have you fucking seen it? But let's start with the positives, or both of them. Regardless of what's going on within them, Miller still has something special when it comes to the layouts. The panelling's so inventive and he can just fit so many on one page, and he also knows which pages need more space and he isn't afraid of giving a moment a double page spread, and it's just something that I've always admired with him, and I'm just glad it's still here in The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And he can use that to create whichever effect he wants, whether it's to make you feel a bit isolated or to make you feel overwhelmed with just how much stuff's going on. And I think from looking at the layouts and the panelling, it's clear that he still has that intention behind his work. It's just that the rest of the art doesn't really convey the message that well. But still, you know, credit where it's due. Additionally, there are a couple of pages that somewhat capture the same look and vibe as the original Dark Knight Returns, and remind you exactly why Frank Miller was such a powerhouse in this industry. Sure, I could probably count those pages on one hand, but they're still scattered throughout this book, and it's worth giving it some praise. And it gave me the smallest glimmer of hope that the old Frank Miller that we once knew was still somewhere within this book. And yep, you heard me right there, my second and final compliment was that some of the pages occasionally reminded me of a better book, because absolutely everything else about this book was a complete clusterfuck. This feels like somebody asked ChatGPT to design a Frank Miller book, but the script had been translated by somebody using the bagpipes. There were so many times in this book where I had to try and figure out what I was even looking at. The line work is so harsh and unspecified that if it wasn't a close-up it was pretty much anyone's guess, and there was such little scenery and background detail that the majority of the characters, and not just the ones who can fly, seemed to just be perpetually floating, and I could never figure out why. Was there no gravity in this futuristic Gotham? As well, what I normally love about Miller's style, especially when you're looking at the original Dark Knight Returns or something like Sin City, was how he is a master of manipulating shadow and light to convey whatever he wants. But you would never have a clue that he could do that by looking at this book. There were panels where an object would be entirely shadowed to the point where I just didn't have a clue what I was looking at, and I found myself wondering, was that just some kind of item that I hadn't unlocked in this book yet? And it's a shame too, because like I said, there would be the odd illustration where it looks somewhat like the old Frank Miller, such as a facial expression here or a little bit of dynamic movement, but then the 8 pages after that would remind you of exactly what you're really reading. If a character wasn't wearing a mask or a costume, it wouldn't even be clear who you're supposed to be looking at, and the lines were often so bad that if they weren't wearing a mask, they just looked like they were a survivor of a knife attack. Although the blame isn't entirely with Miller, because the colours from Lynn Varley make it feel like you're on some kind of LSD trip. And I can't remember when I heard this rumour, it might have been back during the iFanboy days, but they said that this was the first time that Varley had ever done the colouring digitally. Which is fine, everybody has to start somewhere, but you think they would have at least had somebody check this before it went to print. How did anybody think that this look was going to be received well? Pretty much everything falls into 3 categories. It's either completely void of a background, tonally flat so there's no sense of scale or depth, or you just have some bizarre neon gradient like when you see petrol go into a puddle. And I've never looked at that and gone, ooh, that reminds me of Gotham. Honestly, there is so much wrong with the art in The Dark Knight Strikes Again that there's no natural place for me to stop. I just have to be comfortable in knowing that I've highlighted the main issues, and that if I'm showing it on the screen, it pretty much speaks for itself. And I just find the choice when it comes to the Absolute Edition to couple this with The Dark Knight Returns to be quite a fortunate one, and that probably is the best way to experience this book, by not reading it at all and just going back to the original. And if you did want to check this out in the Absolute format, you can get it for a little bit less with the discount codes that we've got with the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Jumping into the story section now, and where do I even begin? If the purpose of a book is to ignite thought and conversation, then maybe The Dark Knight Strikes Again really is a great success, because so much was going through my head whilst reading this. And yeah, let's address the obvious fact that I'm a bit of a dumb reader and sometimes convoluted plots can go over my head. I'm not afraid to admit that, but there's a massive difference between a convoluted plot and a straight up mess. It felt like Miller had so many different storylines that he was determined to cram in here and just refused to cut anything out. But okay, let's try and keep this balanced and bring some positives to the table, because there are some concepts in here that Miller attempts that are quite interesting. Superman and the expanded cast of superheroes and them forcing themselves to align with this dictatorship that they didn't really agree with, and then later rebelling against that was really intriguing, especially with Batman not really being in the picture much in issue 1. Also, it does feel like there's an attempt to progress the story in this universe from where the first one left off. Batman being underground after faking his own death and having to train this gang up to continue the war that he's been fighting. All of that was great to see, especially because a lot of that roster of the gang was actually the mutants from the previous book. And Bruce taking more of a backseat was quite interesting, and I felt was very reminiscent of storylines that we've seen since, even if this theme has been done better in those books such as in Batman Incorporated and Detective Comics by James Tynion, which honestly I'd recommend reading either of those books over this one. And if you did want to pick up those books but you're from the EU and you want free shipping and free gifts with every order, then the only place that you need to go is Comics Bugle. They're pretty much the Europe equivalent of organic price books, and if you use code WOOF you'll get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale. But my point was that I enjoyed The Dark Knight Returns when I reviewed it last year because of the world that it's set up, and I wanted to see more of it. So at least there was some attempt to try and do that. You can say what you want about this book, but it's very committed to telling the story that it wants to. Beyond that, there is the expansion of the wider roster of the DC universe, which is really fun to see. But if I'm being honest, it felt like they didn't know what they wanted to do with all these characters that were brought into it. And sure, bringing in characters like The Question and having a Ray Palmer in this that hasn't yet been molested by Identity Crisis was really fun to see, but the majority of everybody else fell into the same role really quickly. Everyone from Superman, Wonder Woman to even Plastic Man became part of Batman's fight, but they never really felt like they were part of a team. Again, this book felt like it was AI generated, and it knew what The Dark Knight Returns was and what that book intended to do at the beginning, and tried to replicate what the original had, but with none of the finesse. Take for example the talking heads featured throughout this book. In the original, it has this rigid flow which is very reminiscent of TV screens, whereas this wanted to feel more like the internet where everybody's opinion is everywhere. And I got to this stage where I was looking at all these pages where it was everybody other than the main characters speaking, and I just found myself wondering, why am I listening to them anyway? Who knows, maybe that was Miller's original intention, but if deliberately boring and irritating your reader is your goal, is it one that's worth trying to achieve? But yeah, it just felt like there was way too many characters in this book, and also too many plots that were going on, but none of them really felt like they were worth following, because most of them only had a minor contribution to the book as a whole. Had it been more structured, focused and coherent, then it might have been able to hold a candle to the original, but this is honestly one of the most frustrating and droll reads that I've had in a while. And I think the most disappointing thing is that this mostly feels like a Superman book, and it just makes me wonder why Miller didn't do a Superman spin-off within the Dark Knight Returns universe instead, because it kind of tarnishes the original, because the characters that had been built up in there just felt unnecessarily weak. Batman felt like a shadow of his former self, and I get that might be because he spent so long underground. Like, I don't think he'd be any more pale or skinny than me, but it's pretty close. And that's something that really bothered me throughout this book, and yeah, it might be more to do with the art, but I really don't want to go back to that, but it's just the fact that he looked like a child compared to his former self. But even his plans felt dumb, like if nothing else, Batman is always supposed to be the smartest man in the room, so when Bruce allowed himself to be captured and tortured by Lex, it felt like that was something that was really high risk with very low reward. Yeah, I know he needed to learn his plans, but it felt like there were so many different ways that he could obtain them, especially when you've got so many other superheroes that are working alongside you. Like, you've got Flash who could just run really quick, you could also get the Atom to just shrink and get them that way, Superman could probably just fly into the wall, so why didn't he consider any of those options? Because what if Lex killed Bruce as soon as he captured him? What if he didn't decide to reveal his plans? There were so many different variables that needed to go exactly right that it jumped beyond suspension of disbelief. And yeah, I get with comics you need to have a lot of that, but this book pushed me so far that I couldn't have that anymore. And I think if the rest of the writing was up to a higher caliber, I probably would have let that stuff slide. But because Bruce never felt like the Batman that we knew, even the Batman that was established in this universe, it was really difficult for me to engage in those scenes. And Superman's another example because he just feels like he's really not handled well. Sure, in TDKR he was beaten, but that was still whilst he was putting up a fight, and Batman had had time to set traps, and he also had a special suit that was designed for this moment. That is not the case in The Dark Knight Strikes Again, because now Batman Batman can just easily beat him without a moment's notice. Like, yeah, I know there was kryptonite involved, but it just felt like a really weak fight, and why wasn't Superman more prepared? As well, you might notice that I'm talking quite generally about the book, whereas in other reviews I tend to get in deep with certain scenes, but it's mostly because the main problems that I want to bring up in this review happen across the entire book, and also because so many of the scenes are completely forgettable. This book is only 3 issues long, and I can't tell you what happens in each one. Again, I am a bit of a dumb reader, so you might want to give it some benefit of the doubt. And sure, I could probably bring up the unintentionally hilarious moment, like when Superman and Wonder Woman do it so hard that they cause a tsunami, but then also there's just this shark that awkwardly watches. But for the most part, unless it's for the wrong reasons, none of the scenes really stand out, and they all just blend together. And honestly, despite the fact that I knew that the art was what it was, I really wanted to give this book a chance. And when I was thinking of the title for this review, even before I started reading it, I wanted to call it something like Learning How to Love The Dark Knight Strikes Again, but unfortunately, I didn't. Like, I might just name it that for a laugh, because whenever I do a review, I notice there's always someone that doesn't watch the video and just comments based on the title. And 9 times out of 10, they're annoyed. But I really wanted to find some hidden gem of creativity that got lost amongst the hype whilst it was coming out, and find a decent story underneath all the problems that people have already raised over the years, but unfortunately, I didn't. The only really great takeaway that I can have for this book is that it enhanced my respect for the original Dark Knight Returns. Yeah, sure, it's got a deeper context and messages that it's trying to tell you, but at the same time, it does it in a more nuanced way than this. So maybe I could look at The Dark Knight Strikes Again like that job that you have that's awful, that makes you realise what you had before. And you know what? Yep, that's good enough for me. I'm going to keep my original title. And I don't want to delve too much into this aspect, but I feel like if I don't, I'm doing a disservice to this review. But it's widely documented how 9/11 impacted Miller whilst he was writing The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And I heard he even lost friends during that day, which is awful, and I can't imagine how much it must have impacted him. But as horrible as that time period might have been, and I hope I don't come across as insensitive when I say this, but I hear people using this fact as an argument as if it helps this book to make sense when it really doesn't. I get the feeling that the majority of this story would have largely remained the same had it come out before 9/11, and instead I just feel like this unfortunately signifies the downfall of Frank Miller's career. And it's a really fascinating journey to observe, from seeing him be one of the pioneers of the comic medium in the 80s to where his reputation sits now. But Frank Miller is one of those creators where it does seem like there's very much 2 different people that we're speaking about, because his great top tier stories like Sin City, Daredevil, Batman Year One, and the original Dark Knight Returns will never be erased from history, and no matter how many bad books he puts out, they still stand a cut above the rest. But it's clear reading it now that The Dark Knight Strikes Again was the starting point for his fall. It's weird as well, because I rarely use a single review to bring context to a creator's entire career, and maybe it's because that's the more interesting angle to approach this book, or it could just be that I haven't got anything else to say about this book without it sounding like I'm beating a dead horse. But I really did not have a good time with this book, and I wanted to when I first tried it. Even if it would have meant going against the entire comics community, if I genuinely would have found something that I enjoyed about this book, I would be sitting here and telling you about it. And sure, maybe it's just my dumb reader self not understanding the genius that's hidden underneath. I always seem to attract at least one of those people. But if being an intelligent, deep, thoughtful reader would have made me enjoy this book, then I'm okay. We're jumping into the spoiler section now, so if you don't want anything about the ending ruined, because honestly I've spoiled quite a few things already in this review, then make sure you skip to the final verdict. But there's only really one thing I want to talk about in this section, and if you thought I was saving me praise until this part, then you are definitely wrong. Because it's about that weird plotline that's thrown in at the end where Dick Grayson comes back as some kind of invincible Joker. Yeah, saying that out loud, it sounds like I've made it up. And it feels a bit hypocritical, because when I reviewed Flashpoint, I praised the changes that they made to the Batman mythology, especially the ones surrounding the Joker, but here it just feels so ham-fisted, out of left field, and just feels like another example of what I was saying earlier. They just felt like Miller didn't know what he needed to leave out. Had this scene not been in the book, I wouldn't have been sitting around wondering where Dick Grayson was, and had I known that they had plans to do something with Dick Grayson, I wouldn't have wanted it to be this. Also, why was there a lava room? Was Miller trying to parody the Adam West Batman? Don't get me wrong, I get that he's got a Batcave, which is already a bit out there, but a lava room? How long must he have spent digging to get that set up? Is that why he had the weird drill bat tank in the original? And am I supposed to still view Batman as a hero in this book when he's got the exact same lair as Irredeemable? You see, this just leaves me with too many questions that I didn't care about the answer to in the first place. This is my final verdict. and sequels often have an uphill battle, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible to succeed. With the anticipation and hype that had been building up since the 80s original, anything short of revolutionary would have been doomed to be seen as a failure for The Dark Knight Strikes Again. But having read the book, it's as if everybody working on it was aware of those pressures and instead just decided to sink the ship for themselves. From the art to the story to the characterizations, there's really not a lot that I can give it much credit for, and trust me, despite what some people may think, I try to go into every book with an open mind. The only saving grace is the possibilities of what could have been here, the concepts that we could see before they spiraled into being a convoluted mess with little direction. And in a way, it's interesting reading The Dark Knight Strikes Again, knowing the reputation that it's had since 2001, and viewing it as a painful signpost of where Miller was at in his career and where he would go from here. But if you can look past the painful art and the garish colouring, then the story's not really going to do much to keep you engaged either. And if you loved the original, it's probably just going to irritate you with how badly it dropped the ball. And if you've read this book before, maybe when it was originally coming out, and you think it deserves a second chance, then do so at your own risk. And don't blame me if you find a book that's even worse than the one that you remember. And I said earlier that a possible title for this video was going to be Learning How to Love The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and the only way that I can justify that is that it makes you appreciate the original so much more. I can only hope that this book makes more sense if I do eventually go on to read The Dark Knight Master Race, but if it's half as bad as this book, I don't know if I've got the strength for that. And I hate bagging on a book this much, so to sum up The Dark Knight Strikes Again in one sentence: only read this out of morbid curiosity, otherwise you're just going to be bored, annoyed, or some combination of both. So that's a review. It's my first one back since the season of events, and what a way to start. But until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof. See you at the next video.